And just as a further resource, I'm going to put this up on the screen now, and I will send along this slide after the session. We have some mental health resources for you for students, student health and wellness / mental health, the psychological services clinic, and for faculty and staff, the employee assistance program, which you can call or contact via the web, and a local perceptions program, which does also do mental health services. All right. So I am going to quickly introduce Sean. He's a licensed psychotherapist. He's the CEO and founder of Don't Diss My Ability. He's here today to talk with us about being an empath and what that means in difficult times. So different ways of thinking, feeling, sensing, and how we can safeguard our mental health. I'm going to leave you with one little passage that I found in a book called Divergent Mind, Thriving in a World That Wasn't Designed for You by Janara Nirenberg. And she writes, the public and professionals need to understand that people with sensory differences, such as autism and ADHD, and a few other neurodivergent traits, such as sensory processing disorder, HSP, which is stands for highly sensitive person, and synesthesia, experience heightened sensitivity across the board, and these differences affect nearly every aspect of their lives. Sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell correspond to either our mental health or our mental distress, depending on our sensitivities. And so I'm just going to leave you with that, and I'm going to pass it off to Sean. Sean, I'm going to leave this picture up if that's okay. Sean's unable to turn on his camera today, so we'll give you this lovely portrait instead.
Sure. Do you want me to share my slides with everybody?
If you have slides, sure, absolutely. I can stop sharing.
I sure do.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. Firstly, I want to say thank you, Connie, for that awesome introduction, as usual, and welcome everybody to this kickoff Neurodiversity Spring Series discussion. I think, especially at this juncture in time, it's very important for us to explore this topic. So I'm very excited to be sharing this with all of you. And so the topic for today is all the feels. You know, being an empath in challenging times. Again, as Connie mentioned, I'm a psychotherapist and Canadian certified counselor through the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association. And so, firstly, you know, when we talk about what an empath is, it's a way of feeling that goes beyond the five senses. So Connie very briefly talked about the five senses, but different types of empaths experience the world around us beyond our senses of sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste, which can make it difficult for others to understand what we go through. I self-identify as being an empath, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have after, if they do have specific questions about how I process and take in the world around me. Um, and so when you think about who might be considered an empath, well, typically there are people in our lives for whom we would say that they're sensitive, in some ways maybe even oversensitive. And so that can be to sight, sound, you name it, all the different types of stimuli. And sometimes it can be also be words, right? If someone takes a joke, they're offended by it, and someone says, "Oh, you're too sensitive." Well, that's kind of like asking a sponge not to absorb. That's just not possible. That's just how we are. It's how we're built. It's how we're made. And neurodiverse people operate at a different frequency that makes us more prone to being an empath because our minds operate at different levels than others. And so there are different types of empaths. These are the most common. So there's the physical, emotional, intuitive, dream, plant, earth, and animal. The physical empath often feels other people's symptoms in their own body. This type of empath are more prone to suffering inexplicable chronic fatigue. And so if you can imagine being, you know, someone who is a physical empath being around a lot of people who are ill, they will take on a lot of those symptoms themselves, although they may not actually be sick. The emotional empath, I intentionally used the picture of Spock because Spock is a great example of this. He will take on the emotions of others, and this is one that I specifically relate to. So being in a room where you can sense all these different types of emotions makes it very challenging, especially in social situations, especially large group situations, because you take all of those feelings on. So a lot of emotional empaths might actually experience social anxiety or find it difficult to be around different types of personalities. The intuitive empath is also one that I relate to. We have the ability to look at a person and be able to tell how authentic and genuine they are. It's often a gut feeling that makes us apprehensive about a person, or we may be drawn and energized by them based on their energy. And I also want to say that there are varying degrees to all of these. So someone may, think of it as a spectrum. So there may be some people who experience this mildly, moderately, or intensely. The dream empath really can receive intuitive information from dreams that either will help themselves or others. They can really remember dreams that they can draw wisdom from that they've experienced. And this may be a conversation in a dream that it could be with a person, it could be with an animal. It's basically like a movie that's played in their head, but to them has some type of clarity that provides insight and information that they're able to use in their day to day life. The plant empath is energized from spending time in nature. They feel positive energy from vibrant plants. So someone who maybe goes to a lush greenhouse, that would actually give them energy. And you would actually see a difference in their posture. They would perk up where they might be slouched over before because they feed off of the energy that the plants provide. In the same way that if they were in a greenhouse where the plants were dying or not healthy, that would drain their energy. The Earth path can sense changes to our planet or universe. And so this one I find very interesting and fascinating because there may be changes occurring to the planet or the universe that aren't, they could be extremely subtle and we may not be overly aware of, but yet the person feels it. So this one I find is really hard to pinpoint. It's kind of like shift in the force, but no one really knows what happened or where it came from. The animal empath, they have a deep connection with animals, and they're more comfortable with animals sometimes than people. And animals are typically drawn to them. And one quick story that I'd like to share about a client of mine who is an animal empath does equine therapy riding. And when he went to the barn, um, the horse that had been the most challenging actually went right over to him, which was very fascinating because this person is also very, very quiet, and they don't speak very much at all. And so, pretty powerful for this young man to go to a barn that he's never been to before. And the horse that gives the trainers the most problems went right over to him and nuzzled into his shoulder, right? So it's an incredible experience to witness this. And understanding how you learn or process information is the first step in safeguarding your mental health. And I think that this is especially important during the pandemic because we all take in information differently. So auditory, visual, read or written. And before we engage in any of those things, I always try to get people to ask themselves, and this is a question I ask myself all the time: what do we get out of this before doing things like going on social media, watching the news? And if you're not able to answer that, maybe it's not the right time for us to be engaging in that type of material or information. Um, there's so much activity around us that for a lot of us empaths, it's hard not to tune it in. So we have to take steps in trying to tune it out. And so, auditory safeguarding, you want to avoid listening to the news, whether it be radio, television, or social media. Alternatively, you could try to focus on listening to positive music, soothing sounds, or inspirational stories. Um, this is one that I don't experience personally, but it could also be part of it that I do, I guess, would be sound. So again, there are different pitches and sounds that may act as triggering people. So I do try to safeguard myself to make sure that I'm not listening to anything that has too high of a pitch, any screeching or any of those types of sounds. For other people, it may be very loud bass. So really trying to make sure that we limit the amount of information we allow into our pretty little heads, because one of the things about taking this in is that once it's in, you can't get it out, right? Just like once something's seen, it can't be unseen. Well, once something is heard, it can't be unheard. So really trying to limit and safeguard. Another way of looking at this, sometimes we'll see people, clients sensitive sound, and they will wear noise canceling headphones so that they can make sure that they're not overwhelmed by sound. And this also happens in large crowds. One challenge that we have is trying to discern what voice is coming from where. And for a lot of us, we hear everything at once, so it's hard to process all that information. Limiting screen time for visual safeguarding. This is a big one. And again, asking yourself, why is it that I'm going in there? What is it that I hope to get from this? So avoid watching the news when possible. Avoid watching scary, suspenseful movies or television shows. Alternatively, watch things that bring you joy or make you laugh. I find now this is especially important. There's so much media out there that it's easy to just go check the news, but we get drawn in. And unfortunately, the way that the news and the media have been over the last, say, 20 years or so, is that they focus more on negative stories than they do from positive ones, because they know that fear sells. So when marketing these types of media, they're really preying on people's insecurities. And so, you know I kind of compare it to the steak that we might get at, let's say, the Outback. Well, just because you order that big steak and they put it on your plate doesn't mean that we're meant to eat it all, but we typically do, right? So again, trying to acknowledge what it is you're going on there for, what the purpose is, and what you hope to gain from that, and then how do you figure out when to get out of there? I'm just going to go back for a second to the auditory safeguarding, and another part of this for me was understanding the toxicity of relationships and gossip and being pulled into drama that may not have anything to do with you. And so again, asking yourself, what is it that I get from this and how does this move me forward? And written safeguarding, to avoid reading negative news in print, whether it be through newspapers, magazines. Avoid scary or suspenseful books. Alternatively, read inspirational and uplifting stories. Again, in challenging times, it may be hard to find these things, but they're out there. Typically, we're drawn to the negativity because those are the things that are most readily available. So when it comes to neurodiverse stories, one website that I like to share that maybe we could put out later, Connie, would be Different Brains. My friends at differentbrains.org really provide a lot of positive stories, inspirational stories about different neurodiverse individuals and what they've gone through and what they've been able to achieve. The Mighty is another great website that has a lot. It's a mental health platform. They also have a lot of really great inspirational stories. So really, it's about trying to fuel our soul with positivity, especially when there is so much negative happening. And I also get that a lot of people feel trapped at home right now, right? We're isolated. We're not able to get out. And so we are more prone and more likely to try and find information from these different types of sources. The problem with that is when we're looking, again, to ask ourselves as a reminder, what is it we're looking for and what do we hope to get out of it? Setting a time limit for a lot of these is a great idea, because if you haven't found the information that you wanted in 5 or 10 minutes, it's not going to be coming. So really trying to hone in on what it is you're looking for. And my strategy, rather than feel powerless over the things I feel I can't change, I choose to focus my time and energy in areas where I feel I can affect positive social change. And so for me, that means investing in people. I really try to flip the script. It was probably about 5 years ago now when I learned that I was an empath, and the impact that it had on me. Excuse me. And so I remember being at a hotel lobby for a continental breakfast, and the news was on, and I'm not going to share what was on, but it was not something great. And as an empath, I actually put myself there as though I witnessed that firsthand. And so I took on all the emotions and essentially a trauma. And so when people think of trauma, they think of one incident, but really it can be like the death of 1,000 cuts. It can be several small incidents that set us back, that compile and compound one on top of another. So for me, in understanding that, you know, that had an impact on me, I immediately thought to myself, like, why did I do that? Why would I put myself in that situation where I would take and feel that on? And also recognizing that that set me back. Um, it probably set me back at least a day. because I was so consumed by all the negativity that it was hard for me to get outside of that and to rationalize and realize that although that was an important piece of information that was given, how important was it to me in that moment? And was it something that I really needed to know? And I've actually had a lot of people who called me ignorant because I don't watch the news, I don't listen to the radio, and I don't read the paper. And people will ask me, well, how do you get information? And I tell them, you know what? The old fashioned way. If it's that important, somebody in my network is going to tell me. They're going to share that with me. I don't need to expose myself to those things. Right. But the way that the media is now, with, and not just media, but also taking into account social media, there's just so much misinformation and negative information out there that it's hard to know what to believe, what information we should take in. So for me, rather than focus on things that I feel I don't have control over, I really try to hit home and spend my time and energy investing in people and trying to figure out how I can help them in whatever way it is. And that's how, as an empath, I really safeguard myself. That's my strategy. Rather than focus on the news and all these things that are happening around us, I really try to invest my time and energy into people and how I can help them. And that's what kind of fuels me. Our brains are like a garden. They are organic, right? Um, it feeds off what we give it. And if what we're giving it is constantly negative, then we're going to have negative thoughts. It's going to play over and over, right? So we need to nurture our brains. We need to recognize that it is an organic thing. And I really do try to get people to think of it more like a garden. A lot of people have used the analogy of, our brain kind of being a machine with all these cogs that just kind of go around. But really, when there's a part that is lacking in a garden, what do? You nourish it, you feed it, right? And we need to do the same things with our brains. And I thought I had another slide, but for some reason, I'm having difficulty getting there. There we go. So again, rather than feel helpless and powerless about things we can't change, we can focus our time and energy to try and affect positive social change. That can be investing in people, but it's also a great time to revisit a hobby or take up a new one. So again, one of my strategies is that I'm also an amateur chef and chocolatier. So for me, it's going in the kitchen, right? When I go in the kitchen and I create something really unique that's going to take a lot of my time and energy, it forces me to focus on that and that alone, which means I'm able to then revisit whatever it is I'm going through or whatever challenges I was having through a completely different lens. And so now I guess we can move on to the discussion questions. Um, I'm hoping that for quite a few people, there will have been some aha moments. Either people who amongst you who maybe have been dubbed sensitive or overly sensitive, or that there's someone in your network or your family who you might perceive to be sensitive. And what I'm really hopeful for is that this gives you kind of a snapshot into their world and how they process information. Um, I find that this is extremely important because for people who are neurodiverse, we often feel like those closest to us don't understand us. And so, what I'm hoping that this does is kind of give you a glimpse into our thought processes and what we go through, and may provide those aha moments that help you reflect and maybe connect with neurodiverse people in your world in a different light or through a different lens. And so, in our groups, what I'd like to cover, and Connie and Caressa, please, if there's anything you'd like to add, but I'd really like to know if there's anything from the lecture that sounded familiar to you in any way, shape, or form, and whether or not you had any aha moments. Were there any light bulbs that went off for you, and how you could relate this to other people in your network, whether it be, your family, your um, people that you work with, your friends. Um, yeah, I'm really curious to hear how people reflect on this, and how they're able to kind of incorporate it into their own personal lives, especially during a pandemic.
Awesome. Thanks, John. So I think we'll take a few minutes. I'm going to queue up some breakout rooms in just a moment. And again, just a reminder, share only what you want to share. If you'd like to pass, that's totally fine. And we'll take about we'll put in for 10 minutes and see how we're going, and then we'll pop back in for some discussion and Q&A with John.
So Connie, I stop sharing my screen now.
Great.
Hi, Connie. Can I say thank you to Sean for doing this? Because for the last couple of like 5 or 6 years, there's pretty much just been when I used to be on Facebook or YouTube, there's some videos about this. But to actually have it in a university setting like this, that's awesome. Because it focuses on being an empath rather than some of the side stuff that goes on YouTube or Facebook videos gets so far out there, it starts missing the point. So thank you a lot, Sean.
Aaron,
Awesome.
you just gave me goosebumps. I'm so glad.
Cool. Thanks so much. And I'm going to send us now. I was stuck in the breakout room all by myself. All right. We'll wait just a moment for everyone to come back. All right. There we are. And Sean, I'm just gonna start out by bringing you a question that that I popped into the chat and that came up again in my breakout room, which is how do we balance the need to stay up to date on current events and pay attention to what's happening and be responsible citizens, and still, you know, safeguard our mental health in the face of all of these negative realities.
I think, setting a timer and kind of being realistic and staying with it of, again, asking yourself, what is it that I hope to get from this? And again, setting a timer for, how much realistically do I need? Because we fall into this trap, right? Of I'm going to go on and this is what I'm looking for, but then there's all this other stuff that kind of pulls us in and draws us in, and then we get stuck in this loop of, this perpetual negativity with nothing positive on the news. So if we don't shut that down ourselves, I don't think it's a realistic expectation to think that the media is going to do it for us. So we need to take some ownership and some responsibility, same as, the food that we eat and what we put into our bodies. It's not really that different from the information we put into our head. If it's not nurturing, then what is it? Unnurturing. So I think making that distinction, again, asking ourselves, what is it that we hope to achieve? And then setting a time limit for what it is we're looking for. I think too, instead of just going and watching an hour of news, you can Google the information that you're looking for, and find the answer that way. That answers a specific question that you have, and then you can kind of get out and go on with your day. It's not easy. Like I won't say that any of this is easy. It takes discipline, and I don't think it, I don't think it's that difficult for us to realize when we've kind of gotten into that negative loop ourselves, because we can feel it. We feel it in different aspects of our life, and different parts of our body, right? So, and this is something that we carry with us. I mentioned in my group, it's once you've seen something, you can't unseen it. It's there's an imprint there. So this also impacts not just us, but the people we surround ourselves with. We take this home to our family, our kids. So we need to model the behavior we want to see in our kids at home by practicing it ourselves. Again, this is not an easy thing to do, especially in COVID times where people are stuck at home. What else is there to do? Social media seems like it's just such an easy thing to go and check out, and it is. One of the things that somebody said in our group, I won't call them out, but if it's something that they want to share themselves, I would invite them to do that. But somebody mentioned that changing their algorithm, going into their social media and unfollowing people, or news pages that are negative, and really choosing to follow more positive people who have more positive and inspirational messages. And I really love that. I had goosebumps when they mentioned that, because it's really about, again, nurturing your garden. When you see a part of your garden that is dried up and it's not as healthy, what do? Well, we don't avoid it. We need to nurture it. We need to water it. We need to take care of it. And it's the same with our mental health. Were there any other questions that came up from anyone?
Sometimes the sitting and waiting for the questions to be shared is the hard part. But I really want to just invite everyone to unmic at any time, pop anything into the chat. and share anything in terms of what you spoke about in your groups or questions for Sean. Feel free, and we'll just hang out until somebody wants to share something for a moment here.
So one question that came out was, how does the parent, a diagnosed ADHD empath, physical, emotional empath, communicate positively with an 18-year-old not diagnosed with ADHD, physical and emotional empath? I think a big part of it is communication and sharing how you process information. Again, the communication piece is key, but also identifying how do you process information. So if you're a visual person, or actually, I'll use myself as an example, where I'm very sensitive to sound, to the point where, you know, my son makes this screeching sound that, my gosh, it sounds like nails down a chalkboard, played through a bullhorn. To the and at times, depending on what mood I've been in, it's actually brought me to tears. And so for me to sit down with him and say, you know what, when this happens, this is how it makes me feel. It not only hurts my head, but it hurts my body all over. And so when I can communicate that with him, and again, I'm very open with my kids. I think it's just as important for our kids to see us cry as it is for our kids to see us laugh. And so when I can sit down with my son and he can see me in physical pain, that helps him to understand what that sound does to me, and he's more mindful of trying not to make those horrible screeching sounds when I'm anywhere near him. But communication is key, really, to explain to the other person how it is that this impacts us, how it makes us feel when this happens. um, you know, and again, I think also picking your spot. If you're frustrated or upset, that may not be the best time to communicate that. And you may also want to think about how you communicate best. If you're somebody who does very well speaking, then I would encourage you to have a conversation with them. If you're more of a written person, then maybe it's a poem or a note to them that describes how you feel when this happens.
Hi, Shauna. Can I caveat off that?
Absolutely.
That's a really good point. And because one of the biggest things about communication with me and some other people, especially having Asperger's, is the patterns that I see. And it's been really difficult for me to explain how I know certain things. And some people will think that I like somehow got into their computer or somehow I know something I shouldn't be knowing. And then you try to explain to them how you know, and it all falls apart. They don't believe you. So I started trying to show them in different situations. So like, let's say one time I read something from somebody and I say, hey, is this going on? They're like, how did you know that? So another time I'll try to bring up an example of what's about to go on, and I'll kind of walk them through it without them knowing, kind of like Columbo, that old detective that acted like he didn't know what was going on. So then they'll see how my process works, and then they start going, oh, that's how you do that. So that's kind of one thing I've learned to communicate better with people with what's going on, because it is kind of weird.
It is, and for some people, they may not like. I'm glad that you're able to do that, Aaron. There are some people, and I use, you know, the couple of some clients that I work with who they can look at a math equation, they know the answer. You know, they where they have difficulty is when someone asks them to show their work, because our minds operate at a different frequency. In a way, I actually advocate for these kids not to have to show their work. Like we're asking them to essentially dumb it down, in essence, to backtrack what they were doing so that the other person can understand how they got the right answer. So in a lot of ways, trying to get somebody who's neurodiverse, who's very forward thinking, to all of a sudden back up in slow motion is like putting cement boots on, right? So I'm really glad that you're able to kind of describe that process. Not everybody's able to do that. I think again, it depends on what type of empath we're talking about. So somebody who may be an animal empath, someone who is not an animal empath, you know, that dog may bark at them, but go right over to the other person. That's a really hard thing for the person to describe or explain, right? It's just that's how it is. That's how it impacts them. So I'm glad. I'm kind of excited that you're able to share that process with people. But again, it does come down to the communication piece, right? I think that we need to try to explain to people, give analogies, use metaphors in whatever way that you can that the other person is going to understand. But I think, again, we also have to take into consideration how we process information, but we have to try to grasp how the other person takes in and processes information. So if I'm verbal, but the other person is written, then me trying to convey that by speaking may not be the way that they can internalize and process that. So again, it really does, hopefully you have a good enough relationship with the person that you can sit down and talk about how each of you processes information and try to accommodate each other so that you have a better understanding of what each of you is going through and how it impacts you. So one question was, being an empath, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? I think that when we don't have safeguards on, it definitely has potential to be a negative thing, because we don't have blinders on, which means we can take everything in. And again, it's like that big steak from the Outback. And don't get me wrong, I love the Outback, but just because it's there doesn't mean that we're meant to consume it all. And so we really need to kind of put blinders on to safeguard ourselves. And it's not that the information isn't important. It's not that it's not valuable, but when it's played over and over in a loop, it really can be tricky to, again, once seen cannot be unseen, once heard cannot be unheard, right? So I think really trying to get a sense of where we take in this information, I think it plays a pretty big role in it.
I just want to bring up something that I think was kind of mentioned briefly, but for folks who are working in STEM fields where everything has to be evidence-based, right? How do we validate these other ways of sensing and feeling where it's not explainable? Is there a way to bring greater understanding to folks who just don't think that way? Especially in STEM fields, I think it's a very relevant question. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
especially like in physics classes, if you try to talk about something that's kind of not not solidified in physics dogma yet, just talking about ideas, sometimes people don't like that because there's no math to it yet. They're like, well, there's no math to it, so it can't be true. It's like, well, there wasn't math to any of this before. They made it up when they got the ideas, but there's like a really big wall there that you're talking about. So it's very hard to talk about STEM stuff in certain contexts of, especially like quantum, at the quantum level. If you don't have that math, even though you understand it, you're pretty much just automatically just shut down. That's from my experience, kind of what happens.
And so, Aaron, that to me that brings up another part. I think there's a fine line between being an empath and then having kind of psychic gifts. And so there's claircognizant, clairsentience. And I would encourage you to look these up. And so some of them, I believe claircognizant is knowing without any relevant information being, learned beforehand. You just simply know the answer. And so for me, in being an empath, in many ways, I am claircognizant. Like I know, you know, so when an empath, intuitive, emotional empath meets someone for the first time, it may take them a little bit to be able to make the distinction between this is somebody that I need to stay away from, or this is someone that I want to get closer to. With me, this is like an automatic process. And so it's a gift, but it's also a curse, right? So there's a lot of positive things that come from that. There's also some negative things because I see through people in a lot of different ways. And so that means I see the good, but primarily I see all the negative. And then based on my own kind of moral compass and my core values, I have to make a decision of whether or not this is someone that I want to be associated with. And as neurodiverse people, we often have this line in the sand of these are the types of people and these are the values that I hold dear, and these are the ones that are not. And if people don't hold those values, then they're not people that we're going to surround ourselves with. So that group of people can get very small very quick. In talking about social media, I'm curious if anybody's heard of Clubhouse. Yeah, a few people. Okay. So I had recently joined Clubhouse, and at first it was amazing. I met all these incredible people. I heard all of these stories, which at first seemed great. Um, and I even, if people were to go on my Instagram, they can see a couple of groups that I joined where I would kind of provide advice or talk to people, and be a moderator. I had to delete the app, um, because a lot of people were sharing stories that were great and they were inspirational, but I had to go through that roller coaster of emotions with them, and I found that that was just taking too much of a toll on my mental health. Although they were great stories, the roller coaster of how they got there was just too difficult. Again, once heard cannot be unheard. And although I'm auditory processing is not um, my preferred way to process information, when it's the only thing that I'm doing at that time and it's a compelling story, I will kind of see that play out as a movie in my head, and then again cannot be erased, right? So I found that all that information, all these stories, although positive, were still having a negative effect on my mental health, and I had to delete the app, and take a break from it. So again, I think being intentional about why we're going in and doing the things that we do, and being mindful of the types of conversations that we want to have, and kind of being in the driver's seat rather than taking a passive role and let it happening to us. For me, it was a hard lesson to learn. It was a little bit too late for me. But when I do go back eventually, I will reshift and focus more on positive things, that I feel I can contribute. And that may be, um, social media tips, marketing, branding, those types of things, or even helping people with ADHD. I met a lot of really awesome, uniquely gifted individuals on the spectrum with ADHD, and formed some really strong bonds there. So that was great. But again, the negative stories that people's trauma I found really really challenging.
I have a question. Sean, what is your take on medication? We're in a society that's, especially with our healthcare professionals that are quick to prescribe medication for people. So what's your take on that?
My take on that is that I can't share my take on that because I'm not a doctor. That's really something that we have to leave to the health professionals who are able to diagnose and prescribe medication. Um, yeah, that's really all I can say about it. It's a personal decision, um, that people want to, need to make. I would suggest that if someone feels like they need to explore medication, then have a conversation with your doctor about that. If you're somebody who is not typically comfortable taking medication, then have a conversation with your doctor or your counselor, about what you could do. So alternatively, again, if someone doesn't want to take medication, my role isn't to convince them to do so, but I try to provide different strategies on, you know, in the absence of medication, which can sometimes act as a bridge, um, if we're not using medication to help build that bridge to where we want to be, how do we do that in a more organic way? Sometimes it can be done through developing coping strategies and really investing more time in yourself. Um, but other times we're not able to do that and we need help. And that may be through the form of medication. I want to address the question about, I'm wondering about the people aspect. It seems pretty difficult to cut people out of your life even when they're toxic, since you have the ability to feel their emotions as well. Um, it is challenging, and again, I share a lot of my own personal experiences with clients. I love my dad, but I don't always like him. Um, I grew up in a household where my kids are the age now that they know that granddad is all the isms and ists. And so we've had some pretty hard conversations with my dad where we said, listen, if you're going to be any of these things, you need to know we're leaving. And it's gotten to the point where we have gotten up and left. So yes, it can be difficult, but I think we also need to understand that we have a role in these relationships. If we don't set appropriate boundaries, then people may not know what they are and they may keep crossing those boundaries. And I think as an empath, it's hard because we're not always assertive in setting those boundaries. But again, it comes back to your core values and engaging with people. What is it that you hope to get out of the relationship? And so one of the stories that I love to tell is that, you know, I'm at a place now where my life or my cup is half full. It wasn't always that way, but it is now. We all have people in our lives for whom that glass is half empty. And no matter how much or how hard they try to take from our cup, their cup will never be full. But the real question is, what do we get out of letting them try? I really encourage people to think about that. When we think about a friend, and Facebook has done a wonderful job at redefining what it means to be a friend, but a friend is someone that when you think of, they add value to your relationship. And when you think of that person, the value that they add doesn't automatically pop into your head. Not a friend. They're an acquaintance. And so they should be treated as an acquaintance. So our friends really are the people who prop you up and never kind of try to take you down or take you out at the knees. So really reevaluating the relationships that we have with people, I think, is a very healthy thing to do. And with the understanding that people will come in and out of your life at different times. They will serve a different purpose at a different time, the same way that you'll serve a different purpose to them. What if people aren't respectful about your boundaries? Well, they're your boundaries to set. A relationship is two ways. And although it may seem harsh, if someone isn't respectful of your boundaries, then I think a harder conversation could be had around how it makes you feel when these boundaries are infringed upon and what course of action you're prepared to take if this keeps happening. Because again, if it's happening, it's to your expense, right? So if you think of it as a bank account and someone is taking and taking and taking, how much are you going to let them take from your bank account before you call the bank and say, no, 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 this can't happen, right? So again, I think it's about setting appropriate boundaries and following through. You know, I use my dad as an example. We have packed up and left because I'm not going to expose my kids to this, even though my kids know all of what this is. You know, my my wife has worked for First Nations communities, and my dad has made negative comments about you know, First Nations communities or negative comments about women in politics. They're just not acceptable, right? They're not in any way, shape, or form. And when he starts to talk that way, I will let him know that this is not appropriate, and if he doesn't change, we're going to leave. You know, thankfully, there most times he has kind of turned because he. What's most important to him is that we're there and he gets to spend time with his grandkids. If his ignorance causes us to leave, then that's on him and not us. And I don't feel bad about that whatsoever.
Okay, so it looks like we're running out of time. By all means, if you have any questions and you want to stick around and ask them for a couple more minutes, that's great. We'll be here. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll be following up with an email. And if you're a student, part of that email will be an invitation to join a Microsoft Teams group related to neurodiversity and focused around kind of more academic issues. So feel free to join us through that mode of communication as well. All right. So thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome day. This was wonderful.
Yes, thank you.
I would have to say awesome day. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
All right. Hi, Brad.
Hi, Connie.
How are you?
Good, thanks. This was super awesome. I just wanted to ask real quick. I was in class until almost 12:20, so I was wondering if at any time there was a plan to share it in another way, like either just sharing the slides or.
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
and yes. We did record the session, and I'll send the link to that. And I will also share my slides, which are very minimal. And I think Sean's slides will be visible in the recording.
Awesome. Thanks. And that'll be in the email you said you're going to send out.
Yep.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Not a problem. Thanks for
Thanks a
coming.
lot for coming, Brad.
Yeah.
Have an awesome day.
This is awesome. Thank you. You all too.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Thank you.